Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first event of our webinar series on the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. My name is Seung-Kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University. The Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA and Indiana University Bloomington are co-hosting the webinar series on this timely and important topic. The international spread of Korean popular culture, known as Hallyu or the Korean Wave, started in the late 1990s with the enormous popularity of Korean TV dramas in Japan and China. By the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, Korean cultural products, including film, music, and fashion, had become firmly established throughout East and Southeast Asia and were receiving serious attention in other regions of the world. The worldwide recognition of Korean popular culture has accelerated in recent years with such events such as Bong Joon-ho's Academy Awards in 2020 and BTS's 2018 and 2019 awards from American Music, Billboard, and MTV. The four speakers in this series, Drs. Sirabal Seji, Candace Apps Robertson, Jenny Wang Medina, and Michelle Cho, will present contextualizing lectures about Korean popular music, literature, film, and TV dramas, and how Americans are learning to appreciate these vibrant forms of Korean popular culture. Taken together, they will provide an in-depth orientation for those interested in understanding this fascinating cultural phenomenon. As of now, we have over 700 people registered for tonight's lecture, and I hope that all of you join the remaining three lectures at 8:30 p.m. on October 22nd, November 5th, and November 19th. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dean Lee Feinstein for his welcoming remarks. Ambassador Feinstein is founding dean and professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. He has served in senior positions in the US government, including as Principal Deputy Director of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff, on the Presidential Transition Team for President Barack Obama, and as US Ambassador to Poland. Please join me in welcoming Dean Lee Feinstein.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Welcome to the first lecture in this series on the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. From Parasite sweeping the Oscars, to BTS on top of the Billboard charts, to Korean novels on the New York Times bestseller list, Korean culture has become a big part of North American culture. I see this in my professional capacity as Dean of the Hamilton Lugar School, or I can just ask my two teenage kids, or consult my favorite source of recipes, the New York Times cooking app, which features delicious Korean and Korean-inspired recipes every day. This series looks at the rise of Korean pop culture across the Pacific, how it came about, and its growing cultural and political significance. The Hamilton Lugar School was thrilled and honored to accept the invitation of the Embassy of Korea to co-host this event. Our school is a leader in the study of international affairs and the languages and cultures that shape the world. Our motto is to change the world, first seek to understand it. That's why we offer instruction in more than 70 languages, most in the United States, we think. And among the languages and cultures we teach, Korean is one of the most popular. At our school, 200 students are enrolled in Korean language study, a number which has tripled in the last 10 years as interest in Korean culture has grown. Leading our Korean scholarship is the Institute for Korean Studies, led by Professor Seung-Kyung Kim, a distinguished scholar and world-class institution builder who has grown IKS to be one of the leading Korean study centers in the Midwest. The program she leads and its vibrancy in HLS is supported by the generosity of this university's engaged and enthusiastic Korean alumni and by the steadfast support of the Korea Foundation. It's now my privilege to introduce the Korean ambassador to the United States, Yi Soo-hyuk. Ambassador Yi has had a distinguished diplomatic career, having served as ambassador to the former Yugoslavia and Germany, as first deputy director of the National Intelligence Service, as a member of the National Assembly assigned to the Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee, as a participant in the four-party talks in 1997, the first chief negotiator of South Korea in the six-party talks, and since 2019 as ambassador to the United States. An author of works on German unification, nuclear weapons, and North Korea, his expertise on economic issues, security issues, and international relations are widely sought in this country and in Korea. He's been awarded the Order of Service Merit from the President of South Korea for his outstanding meritorious service. Mr. Ambassador, I've had the honor of working with many of your counterparts, including two outstanding former US ambassadors to Korea, Mark Lippert and Tom Hubbard, and my former State Department colleague, Ambassador Wendy Sherman. We are honored to be co-hosting this event with the Korean Embassy. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your partnership and commitment to Korean-American relations. And I hope we can continue our partnership when in-person becomes a thing again. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the Hamilton Lugar School. The floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you, Dean Feinstein, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for joining us for the first round of the K-Culture Speaker Series on the impact of Korean popular culture in Northeast Asia. And a special thank you to today's speaker, Professor Sandoval Sesi, who will tell us about K-pop, its history, and why it has become so popular. I am delighted to join the University of Indiana in co-hosting this timely session. During my 30 years as a diplomat, the United States has always recognized Korea's geopolitical importance. The American people knew we were an important ally, but until quite recently, most Americans did not know much about Korean lifestyle or culture. Some may have had parents or grandparents who had fought in the Korean War, but that meant Korea was an old black and white photo, not something current or vibrant. However, now things are changing. Korean pop culture has been in the spotlight throughout the United States and across the world. Without question, it is a global phenomenon. Just this year, the Korean film Parasite won the Oscar for the Best Picture. It was directed by Bong Joon-ho, whose earlier films Snowpiercer and Okja also captivated audiences. And you might remember the singer Psy and his mega hit song Gangnam Style. Just a few weeks ago, BTS's newest single Dynamite made history again in becoming the top-selling song in the United States. I have never been able to see BTS live in concert, but like many of you, I enjoy watching them on YouTube. Recently, one of my American friends curiously asked my opinion, why BTS is so popular among the younger generation in the United States. He said his grandchildren like BTS song so much that they hum the songs and copy their dances all the time. Indeed, at almost every meeting I attend, someone tells me how their children or grandchildren are huge fans of K-pop and how much they love the K-dramas that they watch on Netflix. Well, I'd like to introduce American friends to another particular genre of Korean popular music, so-called trot. It is known for its repetitive rhythm and vocal inflection. You may not know about it, but it is very popular in Korea. During the COVID-19 pandemic, rather than going outside, families are gathering together every week to watch a TV program in which singers compete against each other singing trot. With that being said, these conversations led me to ask why Korean pop culture was receiving so much attention. What is it about my country's culture that so many people love? Korean popular culture is leading the way, but fans of classical music will be familiar with the pianist Jo Sung-jin, winner of the 2015 Chopin piano competition, Kim Eun-sun, the next musical director of San Francisco Opera, and the ballerina Seo-hee, Lee Eun-won, and the ballerino An Ju-won, whose performances I had the pleasure of attending at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And for lovers of literature, the Man Booker Prize winning The Vegetarian, written by Han Gang and translated by Deborah Smith, has opened up a new world. Personally, I feel that Korean literature is a hidden gem, but many non-Koreans don't know about it because of the lack of good English translations. I hope that the new generation of Hangul learners will be able to enjoy and share the excitement of Korean literature. As people embrace this cultural interest, it stimulates their curiosity or desire to know more about Korea in other ways. And luckily, there are many excellent professors and students with a genuine interest and the curiosity about Korea to help. When Americans pursue a greater academic understanding through Korean studies classes and department at the United States universities, the old black and white photos of Korea become colorful. Now our American fans who have taken to Korean culture will continue their love Korea and continue to expand their interest in our country and culture. And as they develop into the future leaders of society, they will bring our bilateral relationship to an even higher level than we can foresee today. That is why we started this speaker series to hear from distinguished experts and scholars specifically on the topic of Korea's cultural influence from academic perspective. I would like to again thank the co-organizers of today's event, especially Dr. Kim Seung-kyung, Director of Indiana University Institute for Korean Studies, as well as today's speaker, Dr. Seiji. I look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim, Dean Feinstein, and Ambassador Yi for your remarks. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Hwang, and I'm an assistant professor of Korean literature and cultural studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. I will be moderating tonight's session and the Q&A following the presentation. We are anticipating an exciting and engaging 2 hours ahead of us, all the more engaging because of, as of current, I was told we have over 875 people registered for tonight's webinar. At any point during the presentation and the Q&A that will follow, please use the Q&A tool to submit your questions for the speaker. Today's speaker is Dr. Cedarbow Seiji. She is a visiting assistant professor at Indiana University. Dr. Seiji conducts wide-ranging research on Korean performance and its consumption in and outside of Korea. and she can be found on Twitter at the K-pop prof. I would also like to remind everyone that a handout to supplement today's talk is available on the IKS website at iks.indiana.edu. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Siddharbhao Seiji.
Thank you so much, Dr. Huang. Well, I am really excited to see everybody here tonight. If Keith could share the PowerPoint. All right, so yeah, next slide, please. I would like to thank the Korean Embassy in Washington, D.C. for initiating this lecture series, and Director Kim Seung-kyung and the IU Institute for Korean Studies for following through to make this idea into a reality. I'm really excited about speaking in a public forum like this. You know, I usually present my research only to small audiences of other scholars. And so tonight's talk is actually meant as sort of an introduction to the issues for an audience that brings a broad array of experience, including those who are just getting interested in K-pop. So although tonight is for sharing with everyone, if you want to connect with my scholarship, I welcome contact through email or Twitter. Next slide. So due to variation in your internet strength, and you know how Zoom is, watching some of the clips might be a little frustrating, and that's why I prepared a handout that has the hyperlinks to all of the clips that I show in this PowerPoint. And so you can find it at iks.indiana.edu. And also I want to give a little caveat that in this talk, I'm really talking about Korean culture in relation to North America. And so it seems like I'm being America-centric. I realize that America is not the world. Anyway, next slide. So Korea is an active exporter of all kinds of cultural products. Although games account for a larger share than the 4 types that we are going to address in this lecture series, these 4, publishing, including novels, music, movies, and television programs, these 4 are actively carrying an imprint of Korean culture, and hence they face different challenges in the export markets. Next slide. So right now, Korea is the 6th largest music market in the world, and the growth has been solid. Korea continues to increase year upon year in terms of its, overall sales of units of music around the world. Next slide. But unlike the impression that many North Americans may have, the Korean music market is really primarily focused on export to Japan, to a lesser extent to China, and to Southeast Asia. The rapid growth in North America in the past few years has been very welcome. I mean, we are all excited that people are becoming so interested in Korean popular culture, but it's still only a small percentage of the Korean music market overall. Next slide. So where did this sudden interest in K-pop come from? Well, the answer to this question, of course, most of you should know, is that K-pop has been here for decades. All of the people that are on the screen right now have careers with more than 20 years of history. But somehow, when the West doesn't notice something, they think it's not a thing. Next. So every generation is always seeking for their own trends. Older generations are often critical of what young people find. But this is cyclical. Like, this is true when young people fell in love with Elvis shaking his hips, and it's still true today as they fall in love with BTS. K-pop has had a harder time expanding its audience into North America because it's foreign, and not foreign from an acceptable place like England. This has meant that the reaction to K-pop has been tinged with perhaps subliminal and unacknowledged ethnocentrism or even racism. whether it's industry gatekeepers or the aging music critics writing for national publications. They pick apart and have always found fault with trending music, especially when it's made by non-white people throughout recent American history. Whether we're talking about Jamaican reggae or American hip hop before it was appropriated and became part of mainstream music industry, gatekeeping has always been rampant and pernicious. That's why Hallyu's success, despite this gatekeeping, has demonstrated such a profound generational shift, an era of borderless communication and consumption, where youth are actually choosing the best product, not what media gatekeepers chose for them. Next. So K-pop is sonically familiar. And because it's sonically familiar, people sometimes say things like, oh, it sounds like it's just copying Western music. To answer that kind of question, I need to explain something about Korean music history. Next. So new forms of music have always represented modernity. Korea really began modernizing at the beginning of the 20th century, and shortly thereafter, Japan colonized Korea. And so under this period of colonization, there was an association that was drawn between Western music, Western scales, instruments, genres, and advanced culture. Koreans, during this time period, they moved away from tradition and they developed many of the foundations of contemporary Korean music. Even the technology at that time impacted music because the limitations of record technology made shorter songs or shorter pieces of music that could be on a record of only 3 to 3.5 minutes, made them more satisfying. But by the 1930s in Korea, new music outsold Korean traditional music. Classical, jazz, tango, and artists like Billie Holiday were enormously popular. And so to illustrate the shift in Korean music, one of the most famous performers in this time period was Yoon Shim-duk, a huge proponent of Westernization in music education. This is her song from 1926, Hymn of Death. Okay. So after the colonial period ended, American soldiers were stationed in the South. And in case you didn't know, they're still there, almost 30,000 of them. And, you know, it was the era when you couldn't just go online and watch Netflix, even before you really had good TV coverage across Korea. And so these soldiers were primarily entertained by live entertainment, and the most of that was actually provided by Korean artists. These Korean artists were responsible for learning and covering every major genre and every hit song that was coming out of America to satisfy these homesick soldiers. Entertainment legends of today got their start by singing for the troops, because basically the best paying music for performers until the 1970s was performing on these military stages. And as an example, we have the Korean Kittens with the lead vocalist Yoon Bo-ki, and this is a very large performance in 1964.
And now take a look at three little gals who broke it up at every base we played, the Korean Kittens.
right, so the same performers who were performing in front of the troops, let's say they are performing in front of the troops on the weekend, they took this music and they took it back into the Korean domestic space, and they adjusted the music into Korean and adapted it for Korean tastes, to fit Korean ears, to fit the political climate of the time. And an example of this is Shin Jung-hyun, who is considered the godfather of Korean rock. He's such an important rock musician that in 2017, Berklee College of Music granted him an honorary degree, one of less than 30 people to get that award. And this is him performing with Yup Jun-dul, and this is a song from 1974, although he actually debuted more than a decade before that. All right. So Koreans really, they adapted all of this singing and playing music, and they followed all the trends, all of the different genres that were coming out of the West. Korean parallels emerged. And so one of the other parallels was American singer-songwriter poets with these political messages also inspired Korean performers. And Koreans took these sorts of political messages and they made music and playing music and singing in groups as primary protest techniques that they used in the 1970s and especially the 1980s as they were trying to democratize their country. So here's an example, Kim Min-gi. It's a song from 1971, but the video footage is from a 1987 funeral protest. All right, so the point that I want to make here is that music in Korea actually means Western music. Music education in Korea emphasizes the principles of Western music. Western classical or art music is accorded the most cultural capital in Korea, even today. You know, the government actually has to make a special program that schools can voluntarily enroll in to include education in traditional music. And that education is done by outside professionals, not by teachers, because the music teachers themselves have not been trained in Korean traditional music, which has become basically a foreign music in Korea. So to illustrate this, I found this third grade music textbook cover image, and you can see all of these instruments, none of which are Korean, although also curiously, they're made out of snacks. Next. So Koreans are not performing Western genres as foreign genres, but as the genres they grew up listening to. Artists like Yoon Bo-ki, Shin Jung-hyun, and Kim Min-gi are the basis of Korean music. And music in Korea has continually been developing in tandem with changing musical trends in America and other countries. Therefore, music from Korea naturally shares many musical commonalities with American pop. So when people treat Korean pop artists as if they are infringing on a foreign to them musical genre, that actually denies the history of Korean music from the last 100 years. But when did this pop actually start sounding like K-pop today? Next. So the start of K-pop and idol pop, well, usually we say that K-pop started in 1992, although the actual term K-pop came later. And that was, 1992 was the debut of Seoul Taiji and Boys. And they had many of these same characteristics that we see in K-pop today. They had synchronized dancing, rap, alternating with sung verses. And of course, the stars had humble public behavior, and they were supported by increasingly dedicated fan clubs. So this is their debut song, Nan Arayo.
입안이 흐르고 흐르면 누군가가 나를 떠나버려야 한다는 그 사실을 그 이유를 이제는 나도 알 수가 있어요. 사랑을 한다는 말을 못했어. 어쨌거나 지금은 너무 늦어버렸어. 그때 나는 무엇 하고 있었나. 그 미소는 너무 아름다웠어.
Believe it or not, they were actually huge style icons. So the narrative about K-pop often surrounds this idea of like factory pop. So this model of idol groups that are formed by entertainment companies to strategically maximize appeal, this was perfected by SM Entertainment's founder, Lee Soo-man, and the phenomenal success of this model continues to be the industry standard. But when people actually criticize K-pop and say that, it's factory pop or whatever, this narrative about authentic artists versus strategically produced performers that is frequently leveled against K-pop, it denies the fact that idol training serves as an intensive trade school for popular performers. I remember when the sounds of Seattle grunge, like Nirvana, were reproduced with a label-built group, Pearl Jam, and we heard exactly the same thing. But why do we criticize music businesses for producing successful products? Do we prefer for them to produce music that flops until both the artists and the music producers go bankrupt? So although the idol training system does leave many disappointed, unsuccessful wannabe artists in its wake, young people go through this training voluntarily because it seems like the best possible route to achieve their dream. Is it acceptable for us to dismiss young people with dreams because they didn't bang on drums in a cold garage in the mythical way of the American music groups? Next slide. So this industry is centered on the idol. And the characteristics of the idol are very, very important to how the entire industry works. Idols are our parasocial kin. They're somebody that we should protect and support in the same way that we show loyalty to our family against outsiders, right? And idols are aspirational role models. They're all around entertainers, singers, dancers, actors, TV personalities. They speak foreign languages, and they're also good sons and daughters, good friends, good citizens. They donate, they volunteer. But at the same time that they're all these amazing things, they are also ordinary. They're just like you, except they worked hard on their performance and on their appearance. So idols are ordinary people who have demonstrated to us that ordinary people can become extraordinary. It's a message of hope. It's a message of possibility, right? And once they're anointed idols, though, there's no room for mistake. They can't demonstrate ordinary feelings. Poor etiquette backstage becomes fodder for gossip pages, and a DUI can seriously damage somebody's career. So they know that their career depends on their fans, and they acknowledge and they thank and they upload greetings and additional content for their fans to enjoy. Next. So new K-pop fans are really attracted to the idol. You know, stunning visuals, intoxicating beats and dances, superior production quality. But if the viewing of Korean media is too selective, it can construct a vision of Korea as some sort of fantasy wonderland. Because in K-pop, fans catch, you know, glimpses of perfection. And you can imagine this better, this more beautiful world, but paired with cultural distance from Korea. And, you know, here in America, we have a lot of cultural distance from Korea. This can actually also lead to exoticization. So within one's mind, it's possible that Korea can become a fantasy world where idols are perfect beings and idol groups are idealized friend groups. Fortunately, most fans eventually realize the dangers in exotification and search out deeper knowledge. But it's also worth acknowledging that right now we're experiencing a boom in K-pop interest. Right now, during this pandemic, even while the music industry is struggling in so many ways. And that can be connected to how precious it is to imagine a more perfect place in a time of stress and uncertainty. Some of these videos from the idols just provide so much balm for the soul. Next. So then we get into the issue of the government, right? So the K in K-pop, it's widely understood to stand for Korea. And idols serve as spokespeople for Korean companies. But because they're part of this highly nationalistic post-colonial society, they also have to meet demands to promote tourism and represent Korea at diplomatic events. So this creates like a sort of tension, because the goal of idols is to have a successful career. And expecting idols to carry the weight of Korea's outward cultural expansion as a national duty instead of part of pleasing their fans, that's tricky. Furthermore, if we exoticize idols too much, that can lead to unrealistic fantasies of Korea. And Korea is a country with its own problems, and narratives of disappointment in the reality of Korea can circulate and create, you know, a negative feedback loop. So to make things more complicated, as idols patriotically stand in for their country, that also feeds a critical narrative of the government as an architect of K-pop, which it is not. And that can be potentially damaging to the international expansion of K-pop. Next. So what about the music? K-pop is a style of training, producing, advertising, and performing currently popular music as perfected in Korea. It's not a genre. So that's something that people are always struggling with. K-pop is genre fluid, and it's ocular centric. It's emphasizing visuality, music videos, choreographed dance, attractive stars. And so because people often really struggle with this genre fluid idea, I pieced together 3 songs by Girls' Generation released in 2010 and 2011 that demonstrate the vast genre fluidity, even in a group like Girls' Generation.
반짝여 날 일으켜줄래 사람들은 모두 원하지 더 빨리 더 많이 난 평범한 소년걸 역사는 새롭게 쓰여지게 될걸 주인공은 바로 너 Bring the boys out. Girls' generation make you feel the heat. I wanna dance right now. 내가 이끌어줄게.
So as you could kind of see from that clip, in K-pop, languages are mixed. You put some words of English in the middle of a Korean song. But more than that, it just rejects linguistic rules, even linguistic rules of the Korean language. And this welcomes non-native speakers of English, non-native speakers of Korean, it doesn't matter. And because linguistic knowledge is one of the first things that fans seek out, then the actual use of the flexible use of language in K-pop creates insiders quite rapidly. The vocals in K-pop, they're created for multiple voices. A Girls' Generation that you just heard, that's a 9-member group. And there's actually an expectation of balancing fairness in time in the spotlight. Fans get really upset if somebody doesn't get as much time as another star. So even while everyone knows that skill levels are unequal, by giving a chance to the less skilled members in a group, K-pop celebrates some sort of pseudo-democracy and emphasizes again that working hard and being dedicated is enough to make your dreams come true. So another thing is that the genres and the styles, like you just saw, they can be juxtaposed in really unexpected ways. And also Korean elements can be added. Although this is relatively rare in the past, now through the use of the Korean language and judicious but not overwhelming introduction of Korean cultural elements, fans actually are experiencing K-pop as this manifestation of themselves as world citizens. And the very act of consuming K-pop positions them to be cosmopolitan and open-minded. And to illustrate this, I'm going to play for you guys a little bit of MC Mong's 2019 all-kill hit, Fame, which features Pansori-trained vocalist Song Ga-in. All right, next. So since Michael Jackson debuted as a soloist, there has never been as much of an emphasis on dance in the performance of popular music as we see in idol K-pop. But with K-pop, it's not just one artist in the industry focusing on dance. It's the majority of idol groups focus on dance. Dance in K-pop is performed by a sculpted, honed body, and each routine is exhaustively practiced to achieve perfect synchronization. Dance in K-pop is so amazing. It welcomes fan participation, but the choreography can also be really physically demanding. And that can even mean that the vocals may be lip synced, but the dance is so essential to the liveness in the performance that the dance being live is more important than the vocals being live. And so, this dancing along instead of singing along actually becomes like a big part of K-pop fandom. Next. And one of my favorite things, and I'm just finishing up an article on this topic with help from some of my friends on Twitter, is intertextuality. Intertextuality exists in all cultural texts, but in K-pop, it is so thick. So the intertextuality in K-pop, it has non-Korean texts, like internationally well-known movies and literature and music from non-Korean artists. And it also has Korean texts, like Korean media, dramas, movies, reality TV, advertisements, whatever. And it has group-specific text. So the past releases of the same group and their own myth-making appears within the video frame. And all of this intertextuality then rewards dedicated fans. So, and it provides familiarity too. Like you can see in this little clip from IU's 23 that she has Alice in Wonderland as a theme in this video. She follows the white rabbit, and you can see the Cheshire cat grinning at her on the wall. Next slide. And another example of how interwoven the intertextuality is, BTS is very well known for their intertextuality, and Shadow from earlier this year, the lyrics in this song actually reference 4 previous BTS songs. So if you're a BTS fan, you're recognizing these moments from the past, and the visuals reference yet one more song. And the lyrics also reference Carl Jung's Map of the Soul, which BTS is well known for having examined in several of their different works. And the visuals also show this installation art piece by Anish Kapoor. So all of this kind of stuff coming together at once, it creates so much fun. It's so unraveling it becomes a joy and a journey of its own. And next slide. So K-pop actually ends up demonstrating the best of teamwork. Lyrics, music, production, choreography, videography, sets, styling, all of it is created by the best team in Korea. Fortunately, almost everyone's located right around Seoul. And it doesn't really prioritize ego or foibles of like individual artistic geniuses. Instead, releases by major artists are not rushed, and budgets are lavish. And what happens is that you have high quality tracks and you have high quality MVs. And so it's a satisfying musical experience, or a satisfying visual experience when you're talking about the videos. Next. So K-pop also invites fans into amazing new relationships with artists through the internet, through YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, as well as Korean-specific apps. You can have connection between artists and fans, and between fans and other fans. And because this is the topic of Dr. Epps Robertson's talk, particularly within the context of BTS in 2 weeks, I'm not really going to say anything more about that. But the fact that K-pop creates this highly dedicated participatory fan culture is really important to some of the fun that people have with K-pop. It brings you a whole new community of people from around the world. So next. So to recap, establishing facts about K-pop. Western music is not foreign music in Korea. K-pop's got a 25-year history, and yes, it's a capitalist mode of production. It's made to be liked. It's made to be sold. Why is that considered negative? Okay, next. So what about the non-American aspects that set K-pop apart? Okay, still recapping, the characteristics of the idol attract audiences. You know, Western stars, they value their privacy and their free will more than modeling behavior for fans and youth. The idol is this fantasy. It's constructed for an audience in search of a fantasy. I love fantasy, right? Don't you? So fans find in the idol a new type of star, a new way of interacting, a parasocial relationship. And in this time when we're all isolated from each other and masking up and staying distant, that is so precious. K-pop idols also unavoidably represent Korea, not just their music, but because of that, fans are learning the language, the culture, they're learning about the food. It's new, it's fun, it's immersive. And K-pop's a style of production. It's not just a genre, it's throughout the rule book. And all of the unexpectedness in K-pop actually provides freshness. And aren't we tired of the same old thing? So next. K-pop also embraces its differences. Stars draw on Korean traditions, they play with language in new ways. Meanwhile, fans of K-pop can experience themselves as world citizens through their musical choices. And it's ocular-centric, but you know, the dance and the visuals and how good that looks when you're sharing it on social media, that fits today's visually oriented world. The intertextuality, of course, I just mentioned that. It's so much fun. It provides familiarity, it provides rewards for dedicated fans, and it makes it so that consuming Korean media products becomes almost addictive. And the releases by major artists in Korea aren't rushed, and they're just so high quality. The production quality in K-pop is as good or better than any other productions coming out anywhere else in the world. And so ultimately, K-pop creates these highly dedicated fans that really actively support their artists. Next. So K-pop is expanding into and overtaking Western music markets, and that demonstrates a reversal of a long-established cultural flow from the West to the rest. So as Korean cultural exports continue to increase, Korea, this small country with few natural resources, is experiencing a concrete economic benefit. As a professor of Korean studies who has taught at multiple different schools in the past years, my perspective on this is tinged by the real world impact of K-pop fandom that my colleagues and I can see in the classroom. The enrollments in all types of classes on Korea are growing exponentially. Korean language courses have 5 times as many students as they did 5 years ago. New schools are starting to offer Korean language courses, and schools with Korean, like Indiana University, have expanded the number of classes and offer higher and higher levels. We even now see students entering university and testing into 2nd or 3rd year of Korean based on their study, usually self-study, which was entirely initiated by K-pop fandom. So K-pop fandom clearly is about more than listening to or watching some attractive stars. It transforms into this deep engagement with a new culture and a new language. And even if K-pop's North American expansion only stays at the current levels, which were unimaginable to us a decade ago, within 20 years, the common knowledge about Korea, which once was nothing but taekwondo and kimchi, will become this complex understanding about what was once a sidelined, almost forgotten nation. And this is going to have tangible implications for Korea's power in the world. So I would like to thank you all for sticking with me through all of this. And I really want to urge you, come back for the next 3 talks in this series by my wonderful friends. And I guess now Dr. Huang is going to field some question and answer.
Thank you, Dr. Seiji. Thank you very much for the insightful talk. So there are a lot of interesting questions being raised in the Q&A toolbox, but please continue to raise them. I will try to field as many questions as possible for Dr. Seiji. So the first one that was raised for Dr. Seiji is, will you please talk about the specific foreign influences that Koreans incorporate into their music and performance? I can hear some American/Western influence in some of the music, but it also looks like their physical appearances had foreign influences also. For example, the Korean kittens were wearing Chinese-inspired qipao dress while performing in front of the American troops. Dr. Seiji?
So the wearing of qipao by Korean female performers in the 1950s, 1960s, even 70s and 80s was actually quite common. And the reason why is because qipao was recognizably Asian, recognizably exotic, recognizably beautiful, but it was also a whole lot more revealing of the shape of a woman's body than hanbok. Hanbok is actually designed to hide the natural curves of a woman's body. And we see this with many of the female performers in that time period. And in terms of the influences, different performers obviously were attracted to different genres. Shin Jung-hyun, who I played a clip from, he was really, really into rock, and he got really into psychedelic rock. And you can hear some amazing references to the Doors and to Zeppelin and to other artists within his music. But a huge number of the Korean artists have always been deeply indebted to African-American performance forms. And if you look at the history of the US military in Korea, and actually, Dr. Kim Kyung-hyun is going to have a really interesting book on this coming out soon, talking about how in Korea, the performances for the soldiers were often segregated by race, and therefore, you were supposed to perform Black music for the Black GIs, and you were supposed to perform white music for the white GIs. And these would be happening in different venues in the camp towns. And so many of the Korean artists were deeply engaged in learning different forms of African-American music in order to have their career as performers on the camp town circuit.
Okay, great. Thank you. The second question is, would you consider K-pop as a music genre or an industry, or both? Also, does all or the great majority of the music produced in Korea fit into the so-called idol system?
The great majority of the money made by the industry fits into the idol system, particularly internationally. Fans are pretty unaware of non-idol artists, which is unfortunate, because there are some amazing artists in other genres. Inside of Korea, there are other genres which are also quite popular. The ambassador mentioned the genre trot in his opening remarks. Also ballad, which is basically a slow, emotional song where lyrics, poetry becomes much more important. Ballad also sells really highly inside of Korea. So what's popular outside of Korea is primarily idol pop, and what's popular inside of Korea is idol pop, but also ballad, trot, and there are quite successful punk, rock, indie artists in Korea, and a lot of starving artists as well, as in all music industries around the world. I'm not sure, that was such a multi-part question. I'm not sure I answered all of it.
So thank you. The next question, there are many questions popping up, so I will try to be as diversely allocate the questions as possible. What about the non-Korean K-pop idols? How do they fit into Korean nationalism and the model of cultural soft power?
The non-Korean idols and the whole soft power nationalism convergence is a really, really interesting question. And I think that basically, if you want to be accepted as an idol in Korea, you have to conform to Korean norms, and that includes you have to prioritize the nation. And we have seen in the case of Korean American male artists that they didn't need to serve in the military because they were American citizens before they ever became idols, but then later they served in the military anyway. So that's the amount of pressure that exists onto artists to show their nationalism, that somebody would give up 2 years of their life. Quite a few cases of that, although not so much recently, but ideas towards the military have been changing also. So anyway, when the artists who are international artists, they're also kind of stuck in a sort of vice between the international fandom, particularly from their home culture, and what that fandom demands of them, and what Korea wants them to do. And so we've seen this in the past with some controversies that have come up, particularly in terms of Chinese stars who are trapped between for example, who was it? Any of my former students could tell me this, and I'm blanking the name, but recently one of the stars gave up and actually had to pay a fine for cutting a contract to represent Samsung, because on Samsung's homepage, they differentiated between China and Taiwan. And because of some of the political issues, as a Chinese star, he decided he could no longer be a spokesmodel for Samsung because he believed in one China. And so it becomes very difficult for those stars to thread that line. But yeah, if they want to be Korean stars, they do have to keep the Korean audience and the Korean demands in terms of like being, you know, a good, appropriate idol behavior and things like that. They have to keep to those as well. And so that can be quite difficult. And I think it gestures at why we haven't seen so many foreign people getting involved, even though many enter training, not many debut. And I think that the reason that most of the people who debut are culturally closer to Korea, you know, Korean Americans or Japanese or Chinese or whatever, is because they're more able to adapt to some of the really intense restrictions that idol companies put on them. And, you know, Americans, some of us were just too independent. We just won't let somebody take our cell phone away from us and tell us we have to live in a dormitory even when we're in our 20s or whatever it is. So it's tough.
Yeah. So the next question is, how important is gender in the formation and crafting of K-pop groups? Most groups, or at least the ones that become popular, seem segregated along lines of gender. I'm less familiar with female groups, but the physicality and dynamics and choreography appear different. A North Korean reference here could be the difference between dancing of pop and R&B boy groups from the late 1990s and early 2000s, versus the brief emergence of girl groups in the late 2000s, such as Pussycat Dolls, for one. Both involve a certain level of sensuality, but varying degrees of objectification and hypersexualization.
Well, in the case of Korea, there's a lot of fantasy involved in idols. There's a lot of fantasy invested into idols, and you don't necessarily want to invest a fantasy into an idol that you know is living with an incredibly attractive person that you can too readily imagine they are getting into a relationship with. And so it can really interfere with the fantasy world of K-pop to have these really attractive people of, you know, diverse genders in each other's space, sharing space all the time. And so in the past in Korea, there have been from time to time successful groups that mix male and female performers together, but it has never become standard. And it, you know, a lot of it, I think, comes down to the fantasy issue, because you can fantasize about you know, a whole group of people. And we've seen how fanfic can fantasize about those people and what they may be doing together. But often, you know, if you put them into a more realistic situation, it's no longer fun, you know? I guess. I don't think I answered that question that well. But yeah, there is a lot of sexualization with some of the girl groups. But in recent years, there's been more of an emphasis on empowered images for members of girl groups. And I've been really thankful to see that things are changing in that way. And I do hope that all of those women feel empowered in their daily life and are able to make choices about where they draw the line with their own performance.
So the next question is, if music in Korea is identified with Western music, what would you say is the place of traditional Korean music in Koreans' musical life or the nation's cultural scenes?
Oh, I absolutely love that question. So I actually, I do a lot of music or Korean traditional performance-based research. So if you search my research, you will find K-pop, but you'll also find a lot of things about, like, you know, traditional mass dance drama and stuff like that. And a lot of those traditional performance scenes have become, as Keith Howard says, a sort of circulating system of exchange. The people who come to my performance are going to be the same people who will go to my teacher's performance, and I will also go to my teacher's performance, and then we will all go to see his other students' performance. And so the money that you spend on tickets is just, you know, I spend it on yours, but then you spend it on mine, and all of the money just keeps going around in this tiny little circle. And if you are interested in pansori and you're in Korea and you're going to pansori concerts, pretty soon you're going to know the faces of familiar people in the audience, because it's the same group of people that show up every time. And so these traditional genres, and pansori is one of the most popular ones, these traditional genres have been virtually sidelined, and these days they're often treated as like you know, something to be mined for cultural difference or exoticism, or, you know, some imprint of Korea, but they aren't deeply engaged with by many people in Korea. And it's incredibly frustrating to see some of the really, really highly talented people who are trying to keep traditional performance alive, and how hard they have to work to get an audience.
Thank you. The next question. I am interested in wondering if you can share a bit more about the impact of social media on the expansion and growth of K-pop, particularly for the third and fourth generation idols or idol groups that debuted after 2012.
Well, I do think that this is something that probably Dr. Epps Robertson will be getting into in 2 weeks, because, you know, she does look at a lot of fan rhetoric, and that includes the way that fans are talking about the artists on social media. So I do think that she will be a really good person to answer in more depth about that. But yes, the new ways that social media is being utilized now to build community around K-pop fandom is a very, very important story. It means that all of us can become culture brokers who have introduced our friend to K-pop, and our friend is going to introduce someone else to K-pop, and it just goes on. And it's really fascinating to watch this unfolding on K-pop Twitter.
Okay, thank you. The next question. Some say that the idol system was imported from the Japanese music industry, and in fact, idol culture is huge in Japan as well. What are the differences of idol culture between Korea and Japan?
Well, I'm not a comparative specialist who does work on Japan at all. I do read some of the work by other people. There are a lot of people who credit, as you said, Japan and the model of the idol in Japan with influencing strongly Korea. There are other reasons and other predecessors to the idol system and the development of idols in the planned way that developed under Lee Soo-man as well. And so some people talk about Motown. One of the things that I always tell my students about when I'm teaching about K-pop is Lee Soo-man's very disappointing experience that he had with his first artist that he debuted. He debuted an artist, and when that artist finally took off and started to become popular on that artist's third album, at that point, the artist Hyun Jin Young suddenly got busted for marijuana use and was sent to prison. And all of Lee Soo-man's investment kind of, went out the window, because people's opinion about drug use and marijuana, especially at that time, was very non-permissive. And so one of the reasons that, in my opinion, one of the reasons that Lee Soo-man started to develop idols by training up quite young people was so that he could have more of a hand in character development and in assuring that he was going to have artists who understood what was okay and what was not okay, in order that he would never again lose his entire investment that he'd been making for years in an individual.
So Dr. Seiji, you mentioned in the intertextuality of the art and the music videos of many K-pop groups. How important is the engagement of the fans in realizing or co-creating these art forms? Is part of the appeal that the fans are invited to be engaged or active participants in the art form?
Oh, that is such an excellent question. Actually, in this article that I'm writing right now, part of what I'm saying is that some K-pop artists strategically don't tell the fans what it is. And then the fans are supposed to go and uncover it like an online treasure hunt. And I mean, that could be a ton of fun, right? You get together with your friends, you're like, what does this mean? We have to decode the message, And then other K-pop artists, and I believe it has a lot to do with the type of intertextuality that they've introduced. Other K-pop artists, they announce this is the concept for our new release. And I think that it's partially like, I'm afraid you guys aren't going to get it, and I'm afraid we don't have enough dedicated fans who will go and find the information. So I better tell you what it is. And so, yeah, strategically, if you're really, really popular, the fans will do the work for you. They'll have a ton of fun doing that work, figuring out what is being referenced. And if you're not so popular, then maybe you need to tell them to get them excited about the new concept. So maybe an example of that, right now, I'm so underslept because I've been preparing for this presentation. I'm like losing all of my names of songs and everything else. I'm just gonna leave it there, but it's strategic. Some groups really go for explaining everything, and other groups really leave it up to the audience to decode it. And I am amazed how well the audience does decode it. And I'm also thankful to some people for sharing really astute observations about what the art or what the literature or whatever it is that's being referenced in the media. Some people just work so hard, and they share really excellent videos online or blogs where they explain all about it, or Twitter threads. And many of them have been very helpful for me in uncovering more about it.
Great. Thank you. I'm losing the train of questions a bit here, but let me get back on track. 1 second. Yeah, so the next question would be, it's regarding the rough ratio of domestic versus international revenue that K-pop as an industry makes. Do you agree that K-pop had to aim for foreign markets in order to survive or thrive? What are some of the strategies that K-pop groups have adopted to appeal to an international rather than a domestic audience?
Wow, that's a very complex question. There's a lot of different stuff there. So it's a little hard to know right now. Things are in a lot of flux because of BTS, because BTS's sales are unprecedented in the industry. And so it's pretty hard for us to actually say for right now. So if I'm saying for 2017 or, you know, maybe 2018, then okay, first, do we need to have international in order to support the industry? Yes, at this point, the industry is too big. It cannot support itself on only the Korean domestic audience. If the idol pop industry only had the domestic audience to sell to, we would lose probably 2/3 of the idol groups that we have right now. There just is not enough, especially when you have new agencies opening up all the time, and the existing agencies like SME or YGE continue to develop new groups and debut new groups. So at this point, yes, the K-pop industry is completely dependent on overseas, but it's also completely dependent on Korea, because if we don't, there's a certain way that K-pop artists have to debut. There's like a process that you go through, and that includes, you know, you have to put out your pre-debut, whatever it is, you know, photos, whatever, you can hype up the fact that a new group is coming. And then when you debut, you have to go on to these shows like Inkigayo and Music Bank and all of that. And if you're not on those shows, then you don't get the notice of the domestic audience. And a lot of international fans don't realize this, but so much of the money in K-pop, in the case of SM Entertainment, 80% of the money that SM Entertainment is bringing in as of 2011 was from other businesses, not from selling music. They're making money from advertisements. And the only way that you can get advertising deals is for your stars to be attractive to the Korean domestic audience, and it can exponentially go on from there. You have to get to the level of EXO or NCT or something like that before you're getting international advertising deals. Most K-pop stars can't get the international deals until they become very big and very well known. And so where do you make your money when you're a brand new group? Where do you make your money when you're just debuting? You have to have some kind of fresh, exciting image that is going to convince whatever company it is. Chilsung Saida decides that they want you to hold their drink, you know, in an advertisement. And that is going to be what is able to financially keep your company afloat or financially keep your group going, because sales of musical units are not where the money is coming from in this industry. I mean, yes, for BTS, they can sell musical units like there's no tomorrow. They're amazing. They can sell concert tickets like, I mean, it's just unbelievable, except for the fact that I've seen it and ticketed. But like, they're the exception. Everybody else has to get advertising deals. That's how they're going to make money. That's how they're going to keep going. So this question about like, where is the money in the music industry coming from? When you're talking about, and I have like this great graphic in some other PowerPoint, I would never be able to find it right now. But when you're talking about where the international sales, it's idol groups, it's male groups, and it's physical copies of albums, because international fans are buying all 4 copies of an album. And then when you're talking about where the sales of music is happening in Korea domestically, it's girl groups, it's soloists, it's ballads, and it's idol groups. And they're all together. They're all making a lot of money. Internationally, boy groups, idol groups. Domestically, all of a sudden we have all of this streaming going on, and we have all of this other ways of making money, like the advertisements. So it's so complicated. It's so hard for me to unpack all of that. And I think that was only even part of that question, because that question still had more to unpack, but whatever, we'll leave that question there. Hit me up online, I'll send you stuff.
Yes, I think we've thoroughly exhausted Dr. Seiji's energy, and we're definitely learning a lot from her tonight. There are many, many other interesting questions being posed, but unfortunately, we have to limit it to one final question. So on that note, this is something that was a question that was raised in the board, but also my personal a question too. Okay, how did you get interested in researching this field, Dr. Seiji?
I have been researching about Korean performance my entire time as an academic. So I started out with mass dance dramas, and I also have publications that look at Korean traditional drumming and shamanic ritual performances and things like that. And of course, K-pop is also a kind of performance. Of course, I'm a consumer of K-pop all the way back to when I first moved to Korea in the mid-1990s. And so in 2009, I wrote my first paper on K-pop, and I wrote it about Boa and the border crossing heroines of Hallyu, because I was so excited about Boa debuting internationally. And, you know, I just thought that Hallyu and empowered womanhood was coming into a thing in Hallyu, and it's gone on from there. And I find that when we investigate K-pop, we're actually investigating all aspects of contemporary Korea. And so to understand K-pop, we need to understand everything about contemporary Korea. To understand contemporary Korea, we also need to understand what's happening in K-pop, because it's one of the most vibrant cultural fields that is happening in the entire world right now. And I'm so thankful for all the interest in it. And I am so thankful for my students' enthusiasm. And I'm thankful that there are still a bunch of people listening to me talk at this crazy time. So yeah, thank you all so much for being here. If you want to see the whole clips that we just played in brief, go download that thing on our iks.indiana.edu. And it just has a list with some music recommendations and some future reading recommendations in case you want to learn more. And yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dr. Seiji, for your illuminating talk today. And thank you to those of you in the audience today for attending the session and for your insightful questions as well. Please join us for the second event of our webinar series 2 weeks from now on October 22nd at the same time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be about BTS and the ARMY fandom experience in the US. So thank you again. Thank you very much, and good night.
I'll read all your questions, I promise. Good night.